6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people, for whom for 6 years and 1 day, there was hell on earth. Two great empires have been created in just months. The war enters its 3rd year. There are battlefields in Eastern Europe, in North Africa, and in the Asia-Pacific. Before the year is out, hammer blows will transform the complexion of the war in each of those theaters. Advance will become retreat, and the lives of scores of millions of people will be defined by violence. The Italian invasion of Egypt had started on the 13th of September 1940. The British countered, and by the 20th of that month, no Italian troops were left on Egyptian soil.
For less than 50 hours, advance elements of our mechanized forces ashore had pushed through the Italian positions and cut off the enemy divisions attempting to hold Sidi Barrani. In this preliminary advance on the Western Desert, our forces have been completely successful. The Duce's men, both native and Italian, are on the run.
At the beginning of January 1941, Hitler announced plans to support Italy, and on the 6th of February, he appointed General Erwin Rommel to command the German Libya contingent, which became the Deutsche Afrika Korps.
The leadership qualities of Rommel have always been a subject of great debate and also great myth.
On February 24th, British and German troops clashed in Libya for the first time. On June 15th, Wavell, in command, launched the operation that was hoped would sweep east to west across North Africa. It was called Battle Axe. After 3 days, Wavell cabled his government.
I regret to report the failure of Battle Axe.
Churchill said,
Rommel has torn the new won laurels from Wavell's brow and thrown them in the sand.
Defeat persuaded Churchill to send Wavell to India. Lieutenant Heinz Schmidt, Rommel's aide-de-camp, reported the opposite effect on the Axis.
Everywhere that Rommel went now, the troops beamed at him. He was in the process of becoming a hero.
And what a scoop he was for Dr. Goebbels, who, by lionizing the Marshal, used him to the utmost advantage as a heaven-sent piece of propaganda.
Then on the 21st of January 1942, Rommel attacked. He had 3 German and 7 Italian divisions. Mersa fell to the 21st Panzer Division, with the 15th Panzer on its right, sweeping the British out of Wadi Faraig. Place names often, as Cliff Everton recalled, without associated places.
When you hear the names, you can't visualize what it is. Sit there and say, what would you expect to find there? Nothing. It's just a name.
Rommel pushed northeast of the Gazala line, opening the Battle of the Cauldron at the end of the month. Brigadier Claude Valentin was an early casualty.
I spotted 2 tanks about 1,500 yards ahead. We pulled up and a quick look through glasses made me suspicious of their silhouette. More than ever, as 2 gun flashes from them were followed by a shell arriving about 20 yards away. I halted to collect my thoughts. While doing so, I got Cutler to lug out my bottle of whiskey and we all had a small tot.
Valentin was taken prisoner on June 10th. By the 18th, Rommel had isolated Tobruk.
Rommel wants Tobruk because he wants to be able to bring up his supplies by sea, and it'll make his push towards the Egyptian border much easier.
The fall of Tobruk triggered a no-confidence motion against the government in the House of Commons. The member for Kidderminster moved
That this House, while paying tribute to the heroism and endurance of the armed forces of the Crown, has no confidence in the central direction of the war.
Rommel, the celebrity super general, served in some ways as an excuse for the British forces. That why are we getting defeated? It's because we're fighting a Superman, not because our tactics are poor, our equipment's poor, our leadership hasn't quite got its act together.
On July 1st, Rommel resumed his offensive and continued attacking through to the end of the month. A staff officer, Friedrich von Mellenthin, wrote,
On paper, we seem to have won the Crusader battle, but the price paid was too heavy. The Panzergruppe had been worn down, and it soon became clear that only one course remained, a general retreat from Cyrenaica.
The theater of war grows large, with many players and perhaps many acts before the tragedy's finale.
On the 13th of August, General Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army, an event which, according to Jock Watt, who was there, caused more of a stir in the newspapers than in the ranks of the army.
You couldn't care less who was in command. All you wanted to do was leave in Cairo. You lived from day to day. Who was in command of the generals and people? No idea.
On his first day in command, Montgomery confronted Brigadier Freddie de Guingand.
Well, Freddie, my lad, you chaps seem to have got things in a bit of a mess here.
He was a very distinct character. He didn't dress in regulation uniforms. He had a funny accent. He was the type of character that a lot of the troops took to heart almost as a mascot.
Montgomery withstood Churchill's impatience until he was satisfied that the odds were right. And then, on the night of the 23rd, 24th October, opened his offensive with a bombardment by 900 guns.
And of course there were star shells. It was like daylight. There were star shells flying. Oh, a lot of whistling going on, which is bullets going through the air. But you know, you just carry on with it. If you dropped to the ground every time you had a whistling sound, you'd never get up.
I was standing next to our platoon officer, and he says, Evie, we're going to win this war.
Private Percy Gratwick had worked around Western Australia as a gold prospector. His letters, addressed to a mate in Port Hedland, have been preserved.
Well, old bean, here I am at last. Very sorry I haven't written before, but you know this life. Similar to bush life regarding writing.
In the heat of battle, he earned the Victoria Cross. An eyewitness reported,
Suddenly, without warning, Percy took out a grenade, climbed to his feet and galloped forward, holding his rifle in his left hand. It was so crazy, and he was so quick, the Jerrys didn't even know what was happening.
Percy Gratwick was killed. A week earlier, he celebrated his 40th birthday. And that was the battle. Thousands of ordinary men fighting for their lives, hundreds or thousands of kilometers from their homes. On October 29th, Rommel wrote to his wife,
I haven't much hope left. It is obvious that from now on the British will destroy us bit by bit.
In terms of the mythology, the great Rommel myth, most of that, bizarrely enough, came from the British side of admiring somebody who beat them continually, particularly in the desert. But the view from the German side was that Rommel was a thoroughly overrated commander and leader, careless of his men's lives, very bad with logistics.
The breakthrough began in the middle of the night of the 1st of November. Success was consolidated the next day, when the 4th Indian and the 51st Highland were sent in against Kidney Hill. Their breakthrough opened the road for the 7th and 10th Armoured, which raced through into open country.
In a strategic sense, from Alamein onwards, the British Commonwealth American alliance is on the offensive.
Now, Rommel having been compelled to advance over 1,000 miles in the wrong direction, the smiles come from the man who made him do it, General Montgomery.
On the 3rd of November, Rommel received a message from Hitler.
In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no other thought but to stand fast. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than to victory or death.
Here's one incident that could be multiplied 100 times. A German tank is knocked out, a survivor surrenders, and our boys carry straight through.
13 Corps overran the Italian formations facing it, and the entire Axis line was now falling back as Rommel began his withdrawal along the coast.
One morning we saw a lot of burning going on, and another recce troop was sent forward and came back the signal, oh, it's a general exodus. In other words, the Germans are pulling back.
The pursuit of the beaten enemy continued, and this time there was to be no escape.
By escaping, if only to be pursued all along the North African littoral, Rommel had avoided the total defeat for which Montgomery hoped. But by any assessment, he had suffered a decisive loss, and the Allies, for the first time in the war, could celebrate. This, according to Churchill, who ordered that church bells be rung, was not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. Montgomery's army was going west to link up with the Americans.
The ship I got aboard took the first American troops over to Casablanca in North Africa. We didn't know where we were going until 3 days after, out at sea. We were the first American forces going to oppose Hitler and to fight Rommel.
On the 8th of November, the torch landings took place.
as the first grey streaks of daylight spread across the North African sky, they were still going ashore. It is the most encouraging sign of the change of fortune that we have yet been privileged to see.
General Fredendall, a controversial commander who never visited the front, pulled his force back to the Kasserine Pass. Rommel assaulted the new position on the 19th, smashing into the Allied lines and compelling US troops to withdraw.
The tank in the background has stalled. Its crew is still using the machine gun.
A soldier admitted,
We just lost our heads.
The truth was, as RAF Corporal Peter Baxter wrote in his diary,
The Americans merely lack training in battle conditions, and maybe aren't too sure what they're supposed to be fighting the Germans for.
The American response was to make changes, including the immediate removal of Fredendall. Command of 2 Corps passed to Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Allied forces reoccupied the Kasserine Pass on February 25th. The entry of the USA and events in North Africa, and even more on the Eastern Front, were of great significance. The war had changed. As for events in Asia, that was simply a different war.
Conventionally, the army has tended to have more political power than the navy. They've had different strategies, and that is another sort of political schism, which is actually to bedevil the Japanese war effort right through until 1945.
The naval staff pressed for occupation of the southern part of New Guinea. The combined fleet staff, led by Admiral Yamamoto, argued for drawing the American Pacific Fleet into a full-scale engagement. Admiral Yamamoto's argument was strengthened by an action on April 18th that did little damage and took only 50 lives. On that day, 16 specially adapted B-52 bombers took off from the carrier Hornet on a bombing raid over Tokyo. The raid is in the history books in the name of its commander, the Doolittle Raid. The aircraft lacked the range to return to the carrier, so they flew on to land in China. In response, Japan's Chinese Expeditionary Army was ordered to knock out air bases in Chekiang and Kiangsi to prevent their future use by American aircraft. A force of some 140,000 men was mobilized. Between mid-May and the end of August, the Japanese suffered about 1,600 deaths. The Chinese lost about 40,000 dead. But soldiers were not the only victims.
Willingness to give a military essentially abusive free rein over a civilian population did not seem problematic, and it didn't seem that it would threaten Japan's reputation in a modern wartime environment.
A lady known only as Mrs. Chen gave evidence after the war.
A woman gave birth to a baby in the mountains, and, of course, a newborn cries very loudly. If the Japanese soldiers heard and went into the mountains, the young girls of the village would all be raped and murdered. It was really terrible. But we decided to kill the baby.
The factional clash that was dividing the High Command in Tokyo was resolved with a fatal face-saving compromise. Both strategies would be adopted. On May the 4th, the Battle of the Coral Sea was initiated when Yorktown launched airstrikes against an invasion fleet bound for Port Moresby, the key to New Guinea and the preferred naval staff strategy.
The Japanese had been victorious in every engagement up until that time. Nothing had been able to stop them. They were, in effect, being treated as somewhat invincible by Allied troops who had developed the myth that the Japanese couldn't be stopped.
Around 8 in the morning of May 8th, the carrier forces located each other. For the first time, those serving aboard ships in a naval action never saw their opponents.
The thing to bear in mind about the Battle of the Coral Sea was that both admirals were faced with often the requirement to make a split-second decision about when to launch a carrier strike package, in which direction, and so on, really on the base of incomplete information.
The American carrier Lexington was hit and abandoned. The Japanese carrier Shokaku disabled and forced to retire. And the carrier Zuikaku, though undamaged, lost 40% of her air group. American carriers, too, sending their aircraft to the limit of their range, lost heavily. A final message from one American pilot.
Okay, so long, people. Remember, we got a 1,000-pound hit on the flat top.
The Coral Sea, it's said, is a tactical victory for the Japanese, and I think that that's probably accurate, and that they did sink the aircraft carrier Lexington at a time when there were not many aircraft carriers. But the campaign was turned back, so in that sense it was a strategic victory for the Allies.
Coral Sea compelled Japan to abandon plans for an invasion of New Guinea from the sea, and to attempt instead to take control by overland route. Now the moment for Yamamoto's strategy, destruction of the US Navy, had arrived. The action of the combined fleet was expected to neutralize American naval strength in the Pacific and deal with a small Hawaiian outlier that had provided cover for the carriers from which the Doolittle raiders flew, a place 3,100 kilometers from the nearest continent in any direction, Midway.
The Japanese objective at Midway was to destroy the US Navy. The plan was to entice the US Navy into a trap and destroy it.
Thanks to their codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Roquefort, the US Navy knew the Imperial Japanese Navy's plan. Admiral Nimitz would later toast Roquefort with the words,
"This officer deserves a major share of the credit for the victory at Midway."
Nimitz nominated Roquefort for the Distinguished Service Order, but internal jealousies conspired to deny him the award until 1985, almost 10 years after the cryptologist's death. Roquefort liked to say,
"We can accomplish anything, provided no one cares who gets the credit."
The Battle of Midway opened on June 4th, when aircraft from Admiral Nagumo's 1st Striking Force attacked aircraft and installations on Midway itself. When the aircraft returned to the carriers, the Admiral decided to re-equip them with bombs rather than torpedoes and launch a second attack on the island. The carriers were dispersed. Their fighter cover was operating at low altitude, and flight decks were crowded with rearming and refueling aircraft. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch when ready. Within 5 minutes, they would launch, and the Admiral would stand on the brink of a great victory. But they were, instead, 5 minutes that decisively changed the course of the battle and the war. In 5 minutes, Commander Wade McCluskey of the USS Enterprise's Bombing 6 Squadron led his 37 Dauntless dive bombers in from 14,500 feet in a 70-degree dive at 280 knots. The carrier Alongi was the first hit, then Kanga, last Sorgu, when Yorktown's dive bombers joined the assault.
The Japanese lost 4 of their first-line aircraft carriers, probably their 4 of their 6 best, with all of their planes. And given the size of the Japanese economy, they were not able to replace those losses.
The heart of the Japanese naval strike force was sunk by 10 bombs. This was not, in terms of human life, a terrible battle. In terms of influence on history, it was the front rank.
What it did do was it shifted Allied thinking from defensive thinking to offensive thinking.
The news of Midway was passed to Prime Minister Tojo in typically obtuse language. General Moritake Tanabe told him,
"The Navy has made a great mistake."
Admiral Nobutake admitted,
Our forces suffered a reverse so decisive that details of it were kept a secret.
One Japanese naval captain, wounded in battle, said,
"I could not communicate with the world. All the wounded from Midway were treated like this. It was like being a prisoner of war among your own people."
In 1943 and 44, Japanese shipyards completed a total of 7 new carriers. American shipyards launched 90, and the 200 elite pilots Japan lost were irreplaceable. What mattered most about Midway was not that it was a victory, but that it was a battle with irreversible consequences.
And aircraft carriers with the ability to launch air power became the dominant force in naval warfare.
The empire that Japan had so rapidly expanded was vast. But it was mainly ocean, and after Midway, the Pacific would increasingly be an American sea. On land, Japanese control would be surrendered slowly and painfully and brutally. On February 1st, 1942, with fighting continuing in Singapore, the Philippines, the East Indies, 10 Australian prisoners of war who had surrendered to the Japanese were bayoneted to death on Ambona Island. Max Gilbert was amongst the Australians taken prisoner.
We were, to coin a phrase, lambs sent to the slaughter, because there were only about 1,100 of us, and there would have been only about that many Dutch-led Ambonese soldiers, so the action was very, very brief. And come the end of January, early February, the Dutch capitulated, and that's when I became a prisoner of war. Up till that time, I had not seen a Japanese soldier.
On February 4th, a further 30 Australian prisoners of war were bayoneted to death or decapitated. In charge of the killing, Lieutenant Nakagawa said,
"They were taken one by one to the spot where they were to die and made to kneel down with a bandage over their eye. Men stepped out of the ranks one by one as his turn came to behead a prisoner with a sword or stab him through the breast with a bayonet."
The next day, a further 30 Australian and Dutch prisoners of war were similarly killed. It went on and on. General Thomas Blamey, commanding Australian troops, was a World War I veteran. He said,
"Fighting Japs is not like fighting normal human beings. We are not dealing with humans as we know them."
Every history of the Second World War catalogues such cruelties. This was a war in which non-combatant deaths far outnumbered those who fought in uniform, victims of violence away from any battlefield. In Europe on February 4th, the day that Lieutenant Nakagawa supervised the murder of his prisoners, the 100 Jews of Rakov near Minsk were killed. The first transport, sent from Łódź to the extermination camp at Chełmno, contained Roma. It had departed on January 2nd. Abram Goldberg was an eyewitness.
They fenced off a square block where they put them. It was with extra barbed wire, with a ditch 2 meters deep, 2 meter wide, and those gypsies were the first to be deported to the death camp at Chełmno.
By January 9th, nearly 4,500 Roma had been gassed and buried in the surrounding forests. On the 16th, the first Jews were prodded into the gas vans.
So yes, there was knowledge, but this did not translate into action or a rejection of the regime, because it simply was not important enough at that time.
On January 20th, experts met to formulate a plan for solving the problem of what the meeting calculated to be Europe's 11 million Jews. Held in the leafy Berlin suburb of Wannsee, just over half of those in attendance had doctorates. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the mundane logistics of genocide, said,
"The talk was of killing, elimination, and annihilation."
In mid-March 1942, almost 3/4 of those who perished in the Holocaust were still alive. 11 months later, the same proportion were dead. Abraham Lewin wrote in his Warsaw Ghetto diary,
"The turmoil and terror is appalling. Mothers lose their children. A week-old woman is carried. The rabbi from 17 Zielna Street has been seized. Children walking in the street are seized."
The reasonable question that everybody can ask is, how is it possible that these people, Germans of moral character, could carry out hideous crimes without seeing? Can't you just see that they're people? Can't you see the tears in their eyes?
Moshe Fishman was amongst those manhandled onto wagons.
We had to line up in queues. I was pushed to one side. The sisters, maybe because they were holding on to dead. Who wouldn't?
When Abraham Lewin's wife was taken, he wrote,
"Eclipse of the sun, universal blackness. My Luba was taken away."
We can't even estimate closely to how many people actually survive in Poland. But what's very important to say is that those who survive, survive with the hope of Poles.
On July 22nd, 1942, the gas chambers at Treblinka having been completed, deportations began from the Warsaw Ghetto.
They were shooting into the crowd, to hurry them out. Took them to the railway siding and they crammed them in the cattle trucks, 80 to 100 people, standing room only, no food, no water, no toilet, nothing. Where were they going? We didn't know. Where could they take the people? Where could they take children?
Using this rail network, which they ran with enormous efficiency, they transported Jews from every corner of Europe, and they ran those lines to the network of death camps that they operated.
The ghetto poet, Władysław Szlengel, wrote of the fake station at Treblinka.
There is no cashier, no baggage man. Not for $1 million will you get a return ticket. No one is waiting on the station. No one waves a handkerchief. Only a silence hangs.
I think there really is a lot of evidence, but someone who does not want to be convinced, you can't convince him. If he believes in alternate facts, then how to convince him?
Does war bring out the worst people or the worst in people? Young American Marines on Guadalcanal beheaded 3 Japanese prisoners of war and put their heads on poles. Their commander told them they were behaving like animals. And one of them answered,
"That's right, Colonel, we are animals. We live like animals. We eat and are treated like animals. What do you expect?"
An archipelago of almost 1,000 islands, the Solomon Islands is critically positioned off the eastern cape of Australia. The Japanese called the main island Guararukararu. The Americans called it Cactus. It was Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal was the first true Japanese disaster of the war. If the Japanese had really been paying attention, if their commanders had really been thinking strategically, they would have garrisoned Guadalcanal effectively before the Americans got there.
Japanese troops landed in April 1942 as part of their sweep through the Western Pacific. On July 5th, intelligence was received that ensured Cactus a place in the story of the war, and particularly in the history of the US Marine Corps. The Japanese were observed to be building an air base.
And from that airfield, they based aircraft which could range over all of the Solomon Islands and further south, over the Coral Sea.
Don McFarlane, an Australian planter of coconuts and rubber on Guadalcanal, had escaped to the interior and become one of the coast watchers. Hidden in the jungle, he radioed on August 6, 1942.
Runway in position. Gravel and clay, not cement. Stop. Troops, half labor corps.
Admiral William Halsey of the U.S. Navy paid the highest praise to the Coast Watchers. He said that the Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal saved the South Pacific.
Through rough, almost uncharted waters, cruisers and destroyers of the Pacific Fleet blast the way for the invasion force of the United States Marines.
On August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first landing by American forces in the Pacific, and the first of a series of island names to be indelibly inscribed in American history. The landing met little opposition. The first American casualty was a Marine who cut his hand trying to slice open a coconut. The Japanese force established on Guadalcanal numbered 2,200, mainly construction workers. They were taken completely by surprise and withdrew to the mountains.
They named Henderson Airfield after a Marine pilot who'd been killed at the Battle of Midway. And they occupied that on the 8th.
Smoking shorelines testify to American success in chasing the Jap from a vital stepping stone to Australia.
The night after the initial landing, a Japanese naval task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer caught an Allied force steaming through the 15-kilometer-wide channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. sinking the American and Australian cruisers, with a loss of 1,270 Allied seamen and 34 Japanese dead. Following the Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without support.
They shipped me off to Guadalcanal, 1942. Then they shipped me to another island, Rendova. We hit that island July the 2nd, and my captain says, we're going to be in for a nice July 4th vacation. He set up 4 guns. And sure as shooting, the Japs try to take back the island.
And the Marines, after successful invasion, hold tight to their gains despite counterattacks by the Japs.
On August 18th, the Japanese landed reinforcements on Guadalcanal.
I recall reading one account where a Marine approaching the island is taken aback by the lushness of it and the Edenic qualities of what the island looked like from the sea. But then as he left, he only could describe it as a green hell.
A Japanese document declared,
"Success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal is the fork in the road which leads to victory."
The first Japanese counterattack went in on August 21st. They attacked at night because they believed that Americans, being effeminate, would not like fighting at night. 1,000 attacked, and as often is the case in the heat of battle, the details of what followed are disputed, but not the outcome. American losses were small. Japanese losses were immense, and their commander, Colonel Ichiki, was either killed or killed himself. That the battle is an American victory is not disputed. Marine William Heggie wrote in his diary,
Radio reports claim that Friday's battle was history's greatest slaughter.
One of the songs sung by the Japanese army as it went to war had this verse.
Across the sea, corpses in the water. Across the mountain, corpses heaped upon the field. I shall die only for the Emperor. I shall never look back.
On December 1st, 1942, General Hideki Tojo, recently appointed Japanese Prime Minister, declared,
"Our empire stands at the threshold of glory or oblivion."
The battle for Guadalcanal continued until the final Japanese evacuation at the beginning of February. By that time, 1,600 Americans had been killed, and as many as 32,000 Japanese lost to military action or disease.
75% of the Japanese losses were to non-battle casualties. The US 1st Marine Division had over 10,000 casualties. Of those, something like 1,500 were battle casualties. The rest were health-related.
No one could guess how long, how bitter and bloody was the road that yet lay before them. The road to Tokyo.
The Battle of the Coral Sea had frustrated Japanese plans to take Port Moresby in an amphibious landing.
Port Moresby is important because the Japanese want it so that they can cement their southern defensive arc and also use that position to then harass the northern Australian cities and try and sever the link between Australia and the US.
The alternative to an amphibious landing was to cross the Owen Stanley Range and fall on the New Guinea capital from the rear.
The terrain itself is key, and in many ways it's what defines the Fighting Kokoda, the formidable Owen Stanley Range.
The terrain was simply described by an Australian officer.
Ridge after ridge, ridge after ridge, heartbreaking.
There was an airfield at Buna, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Western Pacific Theatre, decided he would need it for future operations. In July, a small Australian force was sent from Moresby to trek overland to Buna, along a track that took its name from a small village around the halfway point, Kokoda.
This is not a great war of movement. It's not a war of mechanisation. There's not big trucks and lorries going along the Kokoda Trail to resupply the soldiers. Things are carried up by men.
A Japanese force of 2,000 under Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama had landed at Gona on July 21st and was trekking towards the unsuspecting and heavily outnumbered Australians.
From Kokoda on the north, they planned to use exactly the same tactics as they did successfully in Malaya. The troops had bicycles and they would go along the track. The Japanese completely misread the terrain.
On July 23rd, first contact was made. An Australian unit diary reported,
Lieutenant Colonel Owen, after the destruction of all possible stores, material and buildings at Kokoda, withdrew with all troops.
It was the beginning of a fighting withdrawal down the track towards Moresby. Towards the end of September, coming under pressure from relatively fresh troops, the Japanese began their own fighting withdrawal.
The rain was coming down, and there was a long string of dog-tired men straining to get wounded men down.
The Japanese could not expect relief. An attempted landing at Milne Bay had been repulsed. The first time an attempted Japanese amphibious landing had been turned back.
They would come and set up a machine gun alongside of a tree. As fast as one would get killed there, another would take his place. They would do that for a number of hours. You had to think of somebody's son, somebody's father, or somebody's husband.
On January 2nd, 1943, Buna fell to the Allies.
There are tired men here in these heroes of Buna. They've seen death, yet still smile. But they know against the Jap, we have not yet begun.
As the Asia-Pacific War was being fought on sea and across some of the most difficult and hostile land, Hitler's summer offensive for 1942, Case Blue, his army swollen by more than 40 new divisions, had driven deep into Russian territory.
In 1942, as the weather improves, as the roads dry out, as the steppe is firm, the Germans embark on a massive offensive.
The story of Eastern Europe during the months of Midway, of Guadalcanal and Kokoda, is the story of a smashing German offensive that comes unstuck and finally turns the tide of the war. 6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people, for whom for 6 years and 1 day, there was hell on earth. Hitler imagined sealing his empire along the AA line.
Anyone caught of the line he planned, which ran from Archangel in the north on the White Sea to Astrakhan in the south on the Caspian Sea, would be enslaved. A lot of people would be exterminated.
When the good weather returned in the spring of 1942, Hitler would renew the offensive that had floundered in the suburbs of Moscow and drive for the AA line, for the Caucasus, for Stalingrad. In the spring of 1942, the Axis controlled over a third of the population and mineral resources of the world. But the war was not over.
In order to understand 1942, we need to understand that in 1941, the Germans had failed to defeat the Soviet Union.
There were 51 German divisions across Europe, and a further 167 on the Eastern Front. They included various Axis partners and sympathizers. 21 non-German divisions swelled the army for Fallblau.
How do you achieve in 1942 with less resources what you didn't achieve in 1941? And Hitler's solution is economic. He sees Operation Blue, so the German summer offensive for 1942, as seizing vital raw materials in southern part of Russia, predominantly oil.
For Barbarossa, Italy had contributed 62,000 men. For Operation Blue, Mussolini increased this to 230,000, placed between the Hungarian 2nd and Romanian 3rd armies to stop those allies from fighting each other. The main offensive would be carried by von Bock's Army Group South. The prize would be the Caucasus. And the jewel in that particular crown was oil.
If you look at the distances that Operation Blue is going to have to traverse, it is 500 kilometers from the starting point in the eastern Ukraine all the way to Stalingrad. Stalingrad is only the gateway to the Caucasus. The distance from Stalingrad into the Caucasus is another 300 kilometers.
In a preliminary action, von Manstein's 11th Army attacked in the Crimea. 4 days later, the Russians launched their own offensive, Timoshenko commanding the Southwest Theater, exploiting the salient that had been created south of Kharkov. Germany had plans to nip out the salient. The Russians beat them to it by 6 days.
The Russians launched a preemptive strike, which was a disaster.
When von Kleist attacked with 15 divisions and von Paulus brought the 6th Army in on the flank, they trapped the Soviet forces in the pocket they had tried to exploit. Only 22,000 Soviet troops managed to escape the encirclement, and the main German offensive began.
The Germans did not have the resources for a whole front offensive in the second year. So in the summer, they had resolved to strike in the south.
Blue 1, the attack on Voronezh, was to initiate a cascade of conquest. By July 7th, Voronezh had fallen. Blue 2 would strike towards Rostov. The Red Army in the south collapsed. Axis formations flooded the area. The confidence this generated encouraged Hitler to divide his forces. On July 23rd, issuing the directive that Chief of Staff General Halder in his diary termed
both ludicrous and dangerous.
Hitler had several talents which made him a successful leader. One, of course, was this complete self-belief, which basically would carry him through everything. I think one should always be very frightened of people who are completely self-taught. Autodidacts with obsessive ideas are extremely dangerous. Mussolini was another one. And still was Stalin.
Halder wrote,
"The chronic tendency to underrate enemy capabilities is gradually assuming grotesque proportions."
Half the army would head south to the Caucasus oil fields and would really take away Russia's ability to drive its industry and to fuel its vehicles.
From his new HQ, Werewolf in Vinnytsia, an ill-chosen site with heat, humidity, and swarming mosquitoes, the Führer committed the newly divided force to an advance on divergent axes. Army Group A along the Black Sea coast, aiming for the crucial oil cities of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. Within 12 days, Group A had advanced more than 550 kilometers. Hitler ordered Army Group B to advance on Stalingrad.
That hub was a Volga River port we have come to know well, Stalingrad, the pride of this generation of Russians, for it was their city, built in their time.
Von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached the oil fields at Maikop on August 9th. On the following day, von Paulus crossed the Don, reaching the outskirts of Stalingrad and opening his assault on August 19th. When the assault on Stalingrad began, anti-aircraft guns had been entrenched for use on advancing tanks. The gun crews were almost all young women, and they were almost all killed. 1.5 million Soviet women served in the armed forces, around 490,000 in frontline roles, where they were granted one benefit not available to their male comrades: an additional 100 grams of soap.
They dropped more than 1,000 tons of bombs on the city. In the city at the same time, there were around 400,000 people, and during the first week, 40,000 died.
Stalin's Order number 227 simply demanded not a step back. It ordered,
panic makers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot.
To many of Western people, they will tell you because it was totalitarian system, because everybody was afraid, because everybody had the soldier with a gun. But you know that in the reality it's impossible. You cannot find such number of people to shoot their own compatriots.
13,000 Soviet soldiers were executed for desertion or cowardice during the Stalingrad campaign. Forced to strip before being shot, so that their uniforms, destined for reuse, should not have demoralizing bullet holes.
There is one thing we should say about Stalin's style of administration, style of governing. He was ruthless.
Stalin reopened the churches. For the first time since the revolution, officers were to be addressed by rank. A large order from the USSR was received in Great Britain for gold braid. It was, Stalin said,
not just decoration, but also about order and discipline.
So as the war went on, Stalin gave more space to his leaders and became better. Hitler did the opposite.
On August 23rd, the Germans reached Stalingrad's northernmost suburb. On the outskirts, they found a hospital for mentally handicapped children. Ordinary soldiers of the Wehrmacht shot all of the 10 to 14-year-old patients.
So clearly, the German soldiers went into the campaign with a certain mindset of anything goes.
On August 27th, Stalin, the Supreme Commander, appointed General Georgy Zhukov, the 42-year-old son of a shoemaker, Deputy Supreme Commander, and sent him to Stalingrad. Lev Kazevich was one of the soldiers sent under his command.
Доехали до Камышина на поезде. Дальше пути были все разрушены. И от Камышина до Сталинграда тоже шли пешком. Это примерно 100 километров. Причем двигались только ночью. Это был август месяц 42-го года. Двигались ночью, днем немцы бомбили всякое движение.
On August 31st, following a conference at Hitler's headquarters, General Halder noted,
the Führer has ordered that upon penetration into the city, the entire male population be eliminated. Since Stalingrad, with its 1 million uniformly communist inhabitants, is extremely dangerous.
The women, Halder continued, must be shipped off. He did not say where to. Willy Peter Rees, a bank employee from Duisburg, served on the Eastern Front, was wounded twice, and wrote prose and poems. In 1942, he wrote,
murdered the Jews, marched into Russia as a roaring horde, sabred in blood, led by a clown. We are his envoys.
On September 11th, von Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, was at the Werewolf in Vinnytsia to brief Hitler on his plan to take Stalingrad. The attack went in at 6:30 on September 14th. At noon, Axis troops had reached the city center. The main railway station had changed hands 5 times. Over the next 3 days, it changed hands 13 more times.
A large part of the 6th Army and the supporting Panzer Army are in Stalingrad itself. The Russians there are fighting tenaciously a defensive war.
October 11th was a pause as the Germans drew back and prepared for the final assault, which came on the 14th. 300 tanks led the charge into the acres of ruins. Journalist Vasily Grossman recorded the sounds of the battle.
Action stations, get ready, comrades. Tommy gunners coming through on the left flank.
The defenders held. Door to door, room by room. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War.
Although Stalingrad is in ruins, the city has obeyed the order to hold out at all costs. Hitler's main strength has been concentrated here, but the Russians have fought for every yard.
And the biggest mistake was to allocate panzers and so many troops into the city itself. They were actually responding to a Russian campaign of defence. That was the mistake. They didn't even need to be in the city.
We have to mention the bravery of the Soviet soldier, of the Red Army, because unfortunately, Soviets have no idea how to think about the soldiers. They thought that, well, Russia is very big, we have a lot of women, and they will born a lot of soldiers. Soviet officers have no idea how to survive these soldiers. So they just send them in the massacre.
The assault paused on the 15th and resumed on the 18th. On the 21st, Field Marshal Keitel said,
"The Führer is convinced the Russians are collapsing."
The Germans were trying to obliterate the city, and of course that creates rubble. And as other battles in World War II demonstrated, where you've got rubble, you've got a problem for attacking troops, particularly if they rely on armour, and a natural protection for the defending troops.
On November 8th, commemorating his failed beer hall coup and speaking of Stalingrad, Hitler told his supporters,
"That is what I wanted to capture. And do you know, we got it. There are only a few more tiny pockets left."
On the 11th, the German offensive reached the banks of the Volga on a 500-meter front. Ice was drifting in the river, and the Soviet reserve, of which the Germans were unaware, was over 1 million men, with 979 tanks, 14,000 guns, and 1,350 aircraft.
Все это делалось в большой тайне от немцев. Немцы так и не почувствовали, что приближается момент, когда немецкая армия будет окружена. И, наконец, 19 ноября 1942 года.
У нас под Сталинградом морозы были до 50 градусов. Представляете, это вот такой декабрь, там вот это, к январю уже двигалось. 50 градусов. Палатки. А нам-то в танках мы моторы не глушили. Так что нам от мотора даже было тепло, а потом мы через выхлопную трубу вот так рукав откроешь, и тебя это немножко обогревались вот таким способом.
On the morning of November 19th, ever after known in Russia as Artillery Day, the earth shook almost 50 kilometers from the bombardment as 13,541 Soviet guns opened Operation Uranus in thick fog and driving snow.
Вот наша артиллерия заговорила и в течение 30 минут долбила по немецким позициям.
Стоял такой грохот, который мы еще не слышали во время боевых действий до того. Залп дали «Катюши». Обнимались, радовались. У некоторых слезы радости были буквально. Наконец-то мы не будем отступать, понимаете? Да, но мы продвигались вперед.
Within 24 hours, 65,000 of the targeted Romanian troops were prisoners.
What the Russians were able to do at that point is strike at the weak link in the German chain, which were the supporting armies, the Hungarians and the Romanians, on either side of the Sixth Army.
On the 20th, a second assault began south of the city. Encirclement was clearly intended, and to avoid this, von Paulus, on the 21st, proposed withdrawing towards the Don. Hitler's response, issued from Berchtesgaden the same day, was an order to stand firm. The Sixth Army, the largest formation in the Wehrmacht, was trapped in the Stalingrad Kessel, 55 kilometers by 30. On the 22nd, encirclement was completed. Von Paulus sought permission to break out, but Hitler refused.
We must not give it up now under any circumstances. We won't win it back again.
Arthur Schmidt, Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army, offered a feeble assurance to his beleaguered troops.
Just hold out. The Führer will get us out.
In Stalingrad, life became increasingly difficult. Many German soldiers died, not only due to the fighting, but also because of the extreme cold, because of lack of food, lack of provisions. So it became an ordeal.
On December 12th, the Germans launched Winter Storm, an attempt to break through to Stalingrad. The operation made good progress for 2 days. Meanwhile, northwest of Stalingrad, the whole of the Italian 8th Army and most of the Romanian 3rd had been wiped out.
Romanians were fighting for their territories, but the Italians, they were fighting for nothing. They were brought here in order to help Germans conquer this country. From their paradise, yes, from Italy, they were brought to the snow. It was a kind of tragedy for them.
On the 19th, Winter Storm, having got to just over 60 kilometers from Stalingrad, was checked. And on the 20th, Hitler accepted that von Paulus could neither escape nor be rescued. 300 flights a day were needed to supply the trapped Sixth Army, with fighter aircraft transferred to defend the Reich against the Allied bombing campaign, and transports sent to North Africa. Fewer than 30 were achieved.
The army needed 700 tons of cargo every day, at least 500. And not even half of that would be food. It would be everything, ammunition, everything. What they were getting, though, was 85 tons per day.
On January 8th, Rokossovsky sent an ultimatum. Von Paulus contacted Berlin.
Request immediate permission to surrender in order to save lives of remaining troops.
Ordered by Hitler to fight to the last man and the last bullet, von Paulus rejected the ultimatum. The following day, Rokossovsky issued the order.
Rokossovsky was intelligent and well-educated, and I think his methods of war were more effective.
On January 10th, Operation Ring launched 280,000 troops, and 250 tanks in a final assault on the Kessel. On the 22nd, Paulus radioed,
"Supplies all gone. What orders should I give to troops that have no more ammunition?"
On January 24th, the Red Army overran von Paulus's last airfield and his last hope of supply. On the 30th, in a radio broadcast, Goebbels said,
"1,000 years hence, every German will speak with awe of Stalingrad and remember that it was there that Germany put the seal on her victory."
They turn it into a martyr's cause, as it were, to try and hide the reality of this shattering defeat of the Sixth Army. Everybody knew it was a turning point.
Потому что все время грохот, пулеметные очереди, рвутся снаряды, а тут тишина. Мы завершили, наступила абсолютная тишина. Даже как-то непривычно было.
Because no German field marshal had ever surrendered his command, Hitler promoted von Paulus. The field marshal's baton was dropped by air. The next day, the field marshal surrendered his command. Hitler called it
an about-face on the threshold of immortality.
Von Paulus took a different view.
"I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal."
Stalingrad was the last time they fought on equal terms. After Stalingrad, the ratio was 2-1 against the Germans. So they never retrieved the balance of forces that required on the Eastern Front.
There are a bit of a conflicting numbers of how many Germans ended up in the Soviet captivity. 91,000, 98,000, 101,000, 102. But we know for sure that by 1955, when the last ex-soldiers of the Sixth Army were released from the Soviet captivity and went back home to Germany, only around 6,000 made it.
German state radio played the Adagio from Bruckner's Seventh Symphony in memory of a lost army. In 1945, it would be played again, following the announcement of Hitler's death. After Stalingrad, the Axis still controlled more than 2,200,000 square kilometers of the USSR and ruled over the 65 million people who lived there. It would take a further 18 months of fighting before the invaders were expelled.
Stalingrad, while a great victory for the Red Army, it still has the German armies deep inside the Soviet Union. And the idea that the Red Army is one day going to push them all the way back to Berlin still seems like a long, distant prospect.
Stalingrad is the moment in which people on the German home front, in a critical mass, start to blame Hitler personally for negative developments in the war. They don't blame other members of the Nazi hierarchy. They don't blame other circumstances. They start to point the finger at Hitler himself as the author of this disaster.
But the disaster that most threatened morale in the Reich was not events in faraway Stalingrad. It was that their own cities were being destroyed. At the start of the war, it had been hoped that bombing would be conducted according to strict rules. But on August 24th, 1940, an off-course Heinkel bomber dropped its bombs in error on an unintended target. They were the first bombs to fall on London. Winston Churchill, convinced that it had been a deliberate attack, ordered Berlin to be bombed. Arthur Harris was head of RAF Bomber Command.
Winston's attitude to bombing was anything to put up a show.
Churchill championed.
An absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by heavy bombers upon the Nazi homeland.
Studies done by the British military for the British government and by the Home Office suggested that if the bombers started coming over the main centers of population, society would break down. People would panic.
We are in a position to carry into Germany many times the tonnage of high explosives which he can send here. And this proportion will increase all the summer, all the autumn, all the winter, all the spring, and so on, till the end.
Pre-war British projections anticipated a casualty rate of 50 casualties per ton of bombs dropped. In the event, the death toll for the London Blitz was 1 per ton, and the overall death toll in Germany was half that.
For a large number of bombing theorists, there was this expectation that air power was a totally new technology that was going to revolutionize the nature of warfare.
But accurate bomb aiming, pinpointing such targets as factories and rail junctions, was beyond current competence.
It's quite ironic, really, because Britain, who has managed to defeat a German bombing campaign through a very well-integrated air defense network, wanders off quite naively to try and attack German industry.
The Butt Report, analysing the effectiveness of Bomber Command's actions in the summer of 1941, found that only 1 in 4 bombers had dropped their loads within 8 kilometres of their targets. On nights when there was no moon, it was 1 in 20. A new strategy, reflecting the technical limitations, would be adopted. Cities were large targets, difficult to miss. The new strategy was called area bombing. Area bombing became policy following the directive of February 12, 1942, and to deliver it, Arthur Harris, one of the most controversial of Allied commanders, was appointed on the 22nd.
War is a race, and the prize is victory.
Harris's job was defined in the area bombing directive.
To focus attacks on the morale of the enemy's civil population, and in particular, industrial workers.
Harris was, until the very end of the war, unshakable in his belief that bombing would bring Germany to her knees, that the disruption to industry and the effect on civilian morale, victims of what was euphemistically called dehousing, would hasten the end of the war.
The civil population of Germany have, however, an easy way to escape from these severities. All they have to do is to leave the cities, abandon their work, and go out into the fields and watch their home fires burning from a distance.
In 1942, area bombing absorbed 1/3 of Britain's military expenditure and 1/3 of national output. Largely the production of heavy bombers.
There is a received wisdom that the Allied bombing only strengthened German resolve.
Germany had a first taste of what she had tried to give England, saturation bombing.
I actually find this hard to believe. I've read so many accounts written by Germans who experienced the bombing. I think it was a nightmare that is really difficult for us to imagine.
The Allied Air raids increasingly shaped everyday lives of ordinary Germans, particularly from 1942 onwards. Because after 1942, the number of air raids and the intensity of bombing
Essen was first attacked on the night of the 9th of March. And then, on March 28th, 29th, the RAF attacked Lübeck. 234 aircraft attacked. 13 were lost. Lübeck was virtually lost. Lübeck was a port where engines for U-boats were manufactured. It was also an historical, medieval, beautiful city, and it was laid waste.
And some of the targets, I'm sure, were picked at the last minute. We bombed a little tiny town on Christmas Day that they thought might have ammunition being stored there. It was a shame to bomb it.
Germany responded to raids on their historic towns by targeting similarly historic British cities, the so-called Baedeker raids. Harris's escalation in response to Baedeker was the first 1,000-bomber raid, to which he committed his entire front line and all of his reserves. That raid targeted Cologne. The operational order was succinct.
Object: to destroy the city of Cologne.
If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin.
Never seen so many aircraft in the air before in my life. I looked down over the target, nothing but a sea of fire.
At the start of the war, the population of Cologne was 750,000. By the end, it had fallen to 40,000. Barely 2 days after Cologne, an equally massive raid hit Essen, and at the end of June, Bremen was the target.
And I can remember seeing the sky just filled with airplanes. It was really quite a sight. How effective it was, I don't know.
On the night of July 24th, 25th, 1943, a massive raid hit Hamburg. It was Operation Gomorrah. The devastation of Hamburg consumed an area 100 times greater than the devastation in Cologne. Lieutenant Hermann Bock was in command of a flak battery. He saw
a sky so absolutely hellish that it is impossible to even try to describe it. No noise heard by humans could be heard. It was like the end of the world.
There are morale reports saying that soldiers think, well, here we are fighting against overwhelming odds at the front, and back home our wife and kids are being bombed out of house and home.
A 15-year-old girl remembered.
Mother wrapped me in wet sheets, kissed me and said, "Run."
But for most of those flying the missions, there was no doubt.
It was never a question of we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be doing this, never.
The raid on Hamburg destroyed 22 square kilometers, creating almost 43 million cubic meters of rubble, on which people wrote messages in chalk.
Wir leben, Hilda. Wo bist du? We are alive, Hilda. Where are you?
The death toll over 4 nights was at least 42,000. 31,647 corpses were recovered. RAF losses were 87 out of 3,095 sorties, and the United States Army Air Force, in 2 daytime raids, 39 out of 337. Lord Casey watched a film of the devastation of Hamburg with Winston Churchill.
All of a sudden, Churchill gives a start and he says to me, "Are we animals? Are we taking this too far?"
The British Bombing Survey Unit concluded that even the mounting toll of casualties failed to break the hold with which the Nazi Party had over the German population. But following the raid on Hamburg, Albert Speer said,
"The depression among the population was extraordinary."
It was perfectly obvious to the German population and to those serving in the German armed forces that the tide of war was turning against them.
In Japan, the devastation caused by bombing was greater than in Germany because, as Time magazine observed,
"Properly kindled, Japanese cities will burn like autumn leaves."
the end of the war in Europe would allow the Allies to throw all of their resources at Japan. Spearheaded by the B-29 Superfortress, a weapon more expensive to develop and deploy than the atom bomb.
The monster flying machines roared down the runways and took to the air. 300 of them in all zoomed up into the skies on their mission of destruction. Rendezvousing overhead, they pointed their slim needle fuselages toward the Japanese mainland.
In the firebomb raid on Tokyo on March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of mainly incendiary bombs, which incinerated homes made from paper and wood. More than 41 square kilometers of Tokyo burned. Officials estimated the death toll at 130,000. The number has been queried and revised, but remains the greatest loss of life from a single event in the whole war.
The great fire raids consumed Japan. 66 cities are swept by hurricanes of flame.
More than 250,000 buildings were destroyed, and more than 1 million people made homeless.
Majority of the damage was done by incendiaries, and something like 3/4 of the city is estimated to have been wiped out.
After the raid, Tokyo looked, according to Major Shoji Takahashi, like
the biggest and most devastated battlefield one could imagine.
Bombing sent 8 million refugees on the road. 66 Japanese cities and towns were hit. By the summer, the B-29 fleet had reached 600 aircraft, but it was running out of targets.
And things really are, in Japanese cities, really teetering on the edge. People start dying of diseases which are made worse by malnutrition, and the old and the young are affected by starvation.
The morality of area bombing over Japan and in Germany continues to be debated. Its targeting of civilian populations without regard to age or gender has led to comparisons with the slaughter of the Holocaust. Bombing was used by all sides because all sides believed that area bombing could and would be a war-winning weapon. And when the war stopped, the bombing stopped. But if victory had gone to the Axis powers, the destruction of people on the basis of race and religion would have continued. In the end, it's not the flattening of a city or winning of a battle that settles a war. Policy, The grand strategy ultimately determined the outcome of the war, and in every capital except Tokyo, it was not in the hands of the generals and the admirals. The decision makers were the political leaders. At the beginning of 1943, a sequence of conferences began that would shape the war and the peace that would follow it. The first conference at Casablanca between Churchill and Roosevelt was in January.
They discussed our offensive strategy for this year, in which it's intended to hit the enemy's smashing blows on new fronts.
Briefing the press after the conference, Roosevelt said,
"Peace can come to the world only by the total elimination of German and Japanese war power."
Roosevelt's statement ended any chance of a negotiated peace. By the time the conference caravan had moved to Cairo, Allied troops were fighting on European soil. On July 10th, Allied forces in North Africa had launched their invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky put 115,000 British and 66,000 American troops ashore to face a garrison of 315,000 Italians and 50,000 Germans. After a month of bitter fighting, 60,000 Italians and 40,000 Germans successfully evacuated to the mainland. Unlike Dunkirk, the Germans succeeded in preserving their equipment and took more than 9,000 vehicles and all their heavy weapons with them. The conference caravan moved on to Tehran, the first meeting of the Big Three, and the first time that Joseph Stalin had traveled abroad.
A terrific conference, planning to make certain of the destruction of the German forces in the shortest possible time. And these are some of the men carrying responsibility for that most desirable objective.
Tehran is interesting, too, because it really shows the extent to which Roosevelt was willing to, in a sense, push Churchill aside as a means of showing Stalin that the Americans did not march lockstep with the British. He thought that was very important, that Stalin understand that.
Roosevelt, I think, had an elevated sense that he could manipulate Stalin. But actually, Stalin was the shrewdest of the three of them when it came to hard-nosed diplomacy.
At the Tehran conference, Roosevelt began proceedings by outlining Overlord, the plans for the Normandy landing, to a delighted Stalin.
It was really, in the end, yet another example of how Europe first was the American motto.
The British never reconciled to what their Prime Minister called
the bloody Second Front.
I think Churchill wanted to postpone the evil day of putting his own troops up against the very, very hardened divisions of Nazi Germany.
In 1944, the bloody Second Front would open. But the year would open with a decisive campaign on the other side of the world. Which the world knows little about. 6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people for whom for 6 years and 1 day there was hell on earth. In 1918, an armistice, rather than surrender, led to a peace treaty that satisfied no one, and a belief amongst those who had lost the war that they had not been defeated, but betrayed. In 1943, President Roosevelt made it clear that there would be no ambiguity this time. Unconditional surrender was the only thing that would stop the fighting. The day before the Casablanca conference, at which Roosevelt announced his insistence on unconditional surrender, a decree was published in Berlin.
Führer decree on the full employment of men and women in the defense of the Reich.
It has become known as the Total War Decree. The following month, Joseph Goebbels was driven to the Berlin Sportpalast to deliver the Total War speech. He warned his hand-picked audience that
behind the onrushing Soviet divisions, we can see the Jewish liquidation squads.
Goebbels made this famous speech about total war, and he actually for the first time admitted that the fatherland was vulnerable, that victory wasn't an absolute certainty.
He asked his audience 10 questions. He told them they were answering,
especially for our enemies who are listening to us on the radio. Do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can even imagine today?
Goebbels was talking about much more than material production, than industry. He was talking about the mindset of the German people as a whole. He was talking about, we're all in this together, and our fate lies together.
The speech rose to its climax.
Now, people, rise up and let the storm break loose.
The affirmative din from the hand-picked audience continued for 20 minutes after Goebbels had left the building. The Soviet campaign in early 1943 had been thwarted by Manstein's counteroffensive, leaving a salient.
Manstein recaptures the city of Kharkov, and that has created the southern end of a bulge that was already evident in the northern part of the line, and it has now created a southern shoulder to what is now called the Kursk salient.
The Germans decide that their next move should be to pinch out the salient. They call the operation Citadel. But the Kursk salient was as obvious a target to Stalin as it was to Hitler.
Some 300,000 Soviet civilians are being mobilized to build these defenses. They will dig some 9,000 kilometers of trenches. They will have anti-tank ditches and anti-tank traps. They will have underground bunkers. They will have thousands of mines per square kilometer.
The Soviets laid 503,993 anti-tank and 439,348 anti-personnel mines before the Luftwaffe started their attack on Kursk. In the opening 45 minutes of their assault, the Germans fired more shells than they had discharged during the Polish and French campaigns combined.
Как забила артиллерия, как засвистели, это, оказывается, ракета летит.
И бомбят, и артиллерия, и тут и с танками. Команду не слышат. Я командую куда вправо, там влево, туда. Не слышат, мы ногами там толкали их туда, вправо, и значит, влево.
On the day of the offensive, July 4th, Hitler sent a message to his troops.
This day, you are to take part in an offensive of such importance that the whole future of the war may depend on its outcome.
Это было очень тяжелое время. Немецкие самолеты Мессершмитта летали буквально 15-20 метрах над землей. Значит, чувствую, что немцы летят, расстреливают. Ляжешь, слышишь, как пули вспарывают землю, то впереди, то сзади. Кто-то кричит, кто-то уже не кричит и не может кричать, то есть убитый.
Страшно. Бомба свистит, она свистит не видно где. А как рвутся снаряды от минометов, они сильный минометный огонь. Я уже не говорю, там автоматы, там пулеметы строчили. Пошел в атаку, его нет. Я падаю, ползу назад, он лежит, смеется лежит. Глаза, а гляжу, а живота-то нет. Все вырвано, все наружу в него.
In the weeks of continuous fighting, during which the Red Army fired 42 million rounds of artillery ammunition, the Germans were forced back 240 kilometers.
Кто когда как успел врываться в окопы, и в рукопашном кто когда как мог кого выбивать. Имеем много и травм, и всего, но слава Богу, что мы действительно все-таки смогли по-настоящему выполнить свои задачи вот наступления на Курской дуге.
Kursk, in my view, is absolutely not a turning point in the war. It's a turning point in the 1943 summer offensive. And Kursk is the end of the German initiative on the Eastern Front, but in some ways it's the end of the German initiative on the Eastern Front because the Soviets themselves sensibly decide not to attack.
By the numbers, Germany had the best of Kursk. Total casualties, 49,822 against the Soviet Union's 177,847. And Soviet armor lost to Germans in the ratio of 5-1. But numbers don't tell the story. Igor Grebshov was with the Soviet forces.
It was probably the shortest battle as it started on the 5th of July 1943. On the 5th of August, there were fireworks.
A couple of days earlier, on the other side of the planet and of the war, Japan declared Burma independent from British rule. The story in Burma, as in Malaya, was shock, speed, and panic. The Japanese moved from Thailand through jungle they were not supposed to be able to negotiate.
人間やっぱり恐怖心もあるし、それ蛇がやね、短くこの蛇やから猛毒持っとったやつが怖かったですな。名の売り刺されて、ザリガニみたいなやつはこれも死にますわな。猛毒やさかい。また家の中によるサソリはね、前切ってええわいと思って、ああ、サソリや言うたら、捕まえたら、尻尾でガーッとやって尻尾で刺されて、半日やしびれ、俺見ていらんことするから見てサソリ刺しよったりで、半日しびれてもうてからね。
They bombed Rangoon, where the element of surprise cost the lives of a couple of thousand sightseers. A Chinese soldier watched the remnants of the British Empire fleeing from the Japanese.
Corpses on the side of the road covered in gold jewelry, but no one takes it. Someone asked a soldier to trade him a bowl of rice for gold jewelry. The soldier said, "Gold is useless."
Of the women, Yu Shao said,
"Their whiteness was covered by the muck."
The British retreat was agonising. It was carried out over hundreds of miles of largely difficult terrain in often terrible weather, on roads clogged with hordes of refugees, and most of the equipment had to be left behind.
General, later Field Marshal Slim, said of the men,
They looked like scarecrows, but they looked like soldiers too.
Soon there were no British troops left in Burma. Amongst the commanders, according to a British liaison officer,
the general atmosphere of gloom was almost impossible to describe.
And it was actually the longest retreat in the history of the British Army. And it was said to be the Road of Bones.
In July, Japanese headquarters ordered planning of a three-pronged thrust into India. But Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, moved first, launching the Arakan Offensive in September.
The Arakan campaign went wrong for a number of reasons. Fairly obviously, jungle warfare training hadn't reached the point where the Allies could successfully take it on. On the other hand, the Japanese were still reasonably fresh, and they could meet the attackers not only with defense, but with counterattacks.
By mid-May of 1943, at a cost of about 5,000 British casualties, not including those struck down by sickness, the British were back where they started, and the Japanese, having taken less than 2,000 casualties, were still in control.
It showed the need for better training, and above all, the need to create esprit, morale, a sense of optimism and confidence.
These are the first newsreel pictures of this great little soldier, the man who trained British troops to live in the jungle and beat the Japanese at their own kind of fighting. No detail was too trivial for the inspection of General Wingate. He knew that in war, trivial details cost lives. The kit of a man who will live and fight for months cut off in the jungle is an all-important factor.
Major Ord Wingate, one of the eccentric soldier mystic types that pop up in British military history, proposed special units operating behind Japanese lines and supplied by air, the Chindits.
Here they are, for the first time in newsreels, the Chindits. Take a close look at them. Not that it'll help you to recognize any of them, their own mother couldn't. Approaching a village, they prepare for action. They look casual. It's the Japs that look worried.
Wingate argued for groups conducting long-range penetrations behind the Japanese lines to wreak havoc in the Japanese rear areas.
incredibly mobile, moving up their equipment by mules at a pace that dazed the Japs.
The Japanese would then have to divert troops from the front line to deal with them. He called that having your hand in the enemy's bowels.
It was a very radical idea that you could infiltrate forces behind Japanese lines in Burma, and they would go in like the fingers of a hand in columns, and then at certain points they would come together like a fist, attack a target, and then disperse again. Very few prisoners were taken for the simple reason that mobile Chindik columns behind enemy lines had no way of taking prisoners and keeping them alive, and the Japanese certainly didn't want to be taken prisoner.
The first expedition crossed into Burma in mid-February and returned in late April. It had lost almost 800 of its 3,000-strong force. 600 of those who returned were unable to take any further part in the war. 2 weeks later, Ord Wingate was killed in an air crash.
Wingate was very much a maverick. He had more enemies than friends in the British Army. He, of course, died, and with it, the spirit of the Chindits was very badly shaken.
In January 1944, Chiang Kai-shek, who had sent several of his best divisions to support the campaign to eject the Japanese from Burma, warned his allies that a major Japanese offensive was imminent.
It may be expected that before long, Japan will launch an all-out offensive against China.
The Chinese divisions remained in Burma, but their success came at a terrible cost to China. Operation Ishigo, literally Operation Number 1, was the largest action launched by Japanese anywhere during the war. The plan was to neutralize American air bases in China, from which bombers attacked Japanese cities, and open a supply corridor between northern China and Vietnam. 500,000 Japanese were engaged. A greater number fought on the Chinese side.
These pictures of the evacuation of Kuilin might equally well be any one of 1,000 other places in war-ravaged China. Almost the only transport was the single-track railway, and Kuilin station was soon packed with about 20,000 would-be passengers.
The entire Chinese defense collapsed in just 2 months. 34 Chinese divisions simply evaporated into thin air. Almost 100,000 Chinese were killed, over 60,000 Japanese. A senior Chinese officer observed,
Every time the enemy sets his foot down somewhere, that place is scarred. In every corner, every house is wrecked.
そうしたらね、帰ってきたらね、ここ帰ったらね、ここにね、この兄貴の写真がね、飾ってあったんですよ。これは北地で死にましたよ。やられましたよ。
A land corridor to Southeast Asia was never a possibility. And by the time of Ishigo, American aircraft were no longer dependent on Chinese bases. The only beneficiary of the campaign was the Chinese Communist Party, safely headquartered in remote Yan'an, preserving its strength for the fight that would follow the war. At the beginning of April 1944, the Japanese 31st Division in Burma had closed on the British base across the Indian border at Kohima. It was held by a garrison of just 2,000, which had received a last man, last bullet order. Captain Jock Young from Glasgow said,
"Since my orders are to fight to the last man, I will be the last man."
After 5 days of the siege, the garrison was reinforced by a battalion. A British captain said,
"The whole place is one big flap."
The defense held, famously at close quarters. The Japanese turned towards Impal, but the Allied response was now organized and effective.
I was a forward scout. Then we had the corporal leading the rest of the section. But you couldn't see anything. All you could see was a mass of greenery. That was real jungle up there. All of a sudden, the shot rang out. And I couldn't go forward then because I didn't know how many Japs or whatever was there. There was just the one shot. And they shot our corporal, and I carried him back. I was expecting to get shot, carrying him back.
Never well supplied, the Japanese now battled an organized enemy, an almost total lack of reinforcements, and the monsoon.
When we got near Rangoon, the rains came. You can't believe it, but within one night, the fields were full of water and the tree top was visible. Otherwise, the trunk was not there. So you couldn't move.
This forest-covered battlefront presents every kind of problem. It's not surprising that progress is often slow when you consider the immense difficulties of supply.
We existed on parachute supplies, you know. They dropped you the rations by parachute, which the Japs never had nothing like that. So they really chased them.
Then the order was, push them back. They're not going to get any more supplies. They're not going to get any medicine. So they tried to push east. The Japanese could not get the villages to give that much food. So they sometimes forced the villages. So the word went round, get out of the village if they come. The Burmese will go after them now. That you chaps, you bullied us now. They start killing some of them. So they were in a terrible state.
The Japs apparently used to go for this gold teeth. They used to have gold teeth, a lot of them. If you come across dead Japs, you had to search them, see what identification on them, tell who they were. And the chap that we had in the West Kents, he used to look at them and collect their teeth. He got a little bag, gold teeth. Now this is true, I'm not making this up.
The Japanese, they were never taken prisoner, they generally killed themselves.
And as the Japs are so far not in the habit of surrendering, you can read it in the expressions of the prisoners, too.
頭の中に未だにまだ覚えてますよ。それだけ叩き込まれたんですよ。とにかく死ねと。生きて領収の恥を送る中で、だから生きて絶対捕虜になったらいかんと。もうそれは頭の中にまだ未だに90になってまだ覚えてますやんか。そこまで仕込まれたんですやんか。もう生きて領収の恥に生きて帰るとかないと違うんですよ。捕虜になったら。終戦からね、捕虜になるのを逃れてね、 ほんでそれずつ構ってね、ほんで一輪たち行ってね、ほんでお前ここ入れって言われて、辻郎ですわな。3メートルぐらい掘ってね、各人が掘ってね、一つのもんこしらえてね、もうそこ掘り込まれたら上がれしまえ、なんぼ肩みたいで3メートルがあったら上がれしまえ。それはやっぱりね、アメリカ大きさがないけど、やはり戦でやったらいかんけども、まあ背に腹変えられんのでやったんやけども、そやけど貧乏はあれですな。
The Japanese made a colossal effort to supply their army in Burma. They had surrendered control of the seas to the United States Navy, so they built a railway.
Their eyes turned to a land link. There was a bit of railway at each end already, so it didn't seem too much of a problem.
The Japanese succeeded in doing something that the British railway builders could not do, and that is to build a railway line that goes from western Thailand to eastern Burma.
250 miles of meter gauge track constructed in an incredibly short time, really.
From Moulmein in Burma to Bangkok in Siam, they built the Railway of Death. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese, Malays, Burmese and Indians, and 25,000 Allied prisoners of war.
And of those, about 12,000 prisoners died.
Hundreds of thousands of civilian slaves, they won't tell you the truth, of mostly Tamil Indians and the poor Malayans and all that.
If we had a bad time, they had a shocking time. They had no organisation, they had no one to lead them, no one to help them, and they died in their tens of thousands.
They were at the mercy of tropical diseases and at the mercy of the Japs. And the Japs had no mercy.
I think the death toll of Asian labourers was about 80,000.
All were driven like slaves to work. They were beaten if they even paused. Some were beaten to death.
They were driven to toil in the tropical sun. Men died like flies. They say a man died for every sleeper laid along this track.
No chap that was there died on his own. He always had somebody beside him. You'd talk to him, you'd do everything you could for him, even though you knew you couldn't do any more for him, but you'd talk to try and comfort him and everything like that. You'll be right, mate, don't worry about it. You'll be right, you know. Most probably they knew themselves they weren't going to be right.
Men were not the only victims of what became known as the Death Railway. One Australian prisoner recalled the night a train arrived. Young women got out. The Japanese guards lined up with tickets. The women who arrived were comfort women. They were also prisoners of war, of what some have labeled rape warfare. They were part of the most elaborate system of sex trafficking in history. On an official basis of 20 women for every 700,000 Japanese soldiers, women from Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and the Philippines were enslaved in a state-controlled criminal activity. Those who survived bore witness.
I was nearly killed several times. There were men who were drunk and who were brandishing swords at me while making demands for perverted sex.
There was a German equivalent, the Einsatzfrauen, using women who had chosen life in a brothel over death as a slave laborer, or women already imprisoned. A woman in the camp brothel at Buchenwald said,
"Not even the weather was on the agenda. Everything was so mechanical. They finished their business and left."
The Holocaust, too, encompassed sexual violence. Eyewitnesses to mass shootings reported the killers first raping their victims And when the Soviet army reached German territory, rape warfare was again common.
Hundreds of thousands of women were raped because the Soviet army, Stalin, he said, you think that the Soviet army is an army of heroes, but you should always remember that this is the ordinary occupation army.
I went on the hill to have a bit of observation if I can see any Russian trucks and nothing. And on the bottom, there was a lady, she was hiking high for goats she had. And then I went there and, yeah, you come here. You been already home? I said, no. Your sister has been raped by a whole truck of Russian soldiers, and the last Russian soldier mutilated her and dropped her in the next grenade hole.
Total war is not one hell on earth, but many. Sexual violence was one. Another, away from the bullets and bombs, was the deadliest weapon of the war, taking the lives of 20 million. The hell of hunger. In India, in China, and Vietnam, Japan's expansion, directly or indirectly, contributed to the deaths of not less than 5 million people.
India, more famine in a land swept by starvation. The death rate, already 1,000 a week, rises.
The reason for the Bengal famine, man-made or natural causes, continues to be debated. The effects do not. British efforts to deter a Japanese invasion by the destruction of food stores and of many thousands of rivercraft, along with hoarding and speculation by grain traders, are among the causes listed for the famine. But some point to the effects of a cyclone, of falling harvests, of a major crop failure in 1942. What is certain is that when Burma fell to the Japanese in the spring of 1942, India lost 15% of its rice supply, and at the beginning of 1943, faced a food crisis. Which is when Winston Churchill ordered a 60% cut in both military and civilian shipping to the Indian Ocean. He said,
"There is no reason why all parts of the British Empire should not feel the pinch in the same way as the mother country has done."
Biswa Chakrabarti, a schoolmaster, wrote,
"The whole population seems to be moving silently towards death."
He was not, of course, talking about the mother country, but Churchill's attitude to India, and particularly to Indian independence, is well known.
As he famously said, India is no more a nation than the equator, that it had no meaning as a nation. So he completely dismissed Indian nationalism.
In a famine, no one wants extra mouths to feed. The desperate but common ploy of selling children was no longer possible, and peasants resorted to renting their daughters out for the night. Aranga Mohan Das reached a bazaar on the banks of a river.
Then I saw nearly 500 destitutes of both sexes almost naked and reduced to bare skeletons. I had the misfortune of seeing 8 people breathe their last before my eyes. It shocked me to the bottom of my heart.
DC Majumdar wrote on behalf of his village to the Bengal Relief Committee.
There are hundreds of little children, both orphans and those deserted by parents. They require milk, barley, water, etc. if the innocent creatures are to be saved.
Archibald Wavell at last shone. Appointed viceroy, he acted swiftly to impose price controls and other measures, but he received little support from London, whose attitude he described as
short-sighted and callous.
When he learned how supplies were being airlifted to relieve a food shortage in the Netherlands, Wavell said that it was
a very different attitude towards feeding the starving population when the starvation is in Europe.
action to alleviate the famine was finally taken out of concern for the effect the famine was having on the troops being massed for the reconquest of Burma, 60% of whom were Indian. There is little controversy about another famine, the one that devastated Tonkin, the north of Vietnam. It was man-made.
In Tonkin, there's a terrible famine. About 2 million people die of famine as a result of the Japanese stripping away their food and taking it off and then basically wasting it.
5% of the population died. In Henan province in China, at least 2 million more starved to death. The Henan peasants endured a series of biblical afflictions: drought, frost, hail, and a plague of locusts. The harvest fell to 3/4 of its normal level and had to sustain not just the population, but 300,000 nationalist troops garrisoned on them. In February 1943, the American journalist Theodore White visited Henan. He learned from a doctor that a woman had been caught boiling her baby. When the Nationalist Army poured back through the affected areas in the face of Operation Ishigo, the peasants took revenge, disarming as many as 50,000 of their own soldiers and murdering perhaps a fifth of them. Europe, too, lost millions to starvation. By January 1942, the death rate in Greece was 2,000 a day, and infant mortality had risen to over 50%. Churchill was steadfast in refusing to allow food aid past the Royal Navy's blockade. The British Minister of State in Cairo, Oliver Littleton, telegrammed to his government,
"History will, I believe, pronounce stern judgment on our policy."
The final death toll in Greece was 300,000. But the Soviet Union dwarfs all of these tragedies. As many as 9 million died of starvation during the war. Between 6 and 7 million in areas under German control, including prisoners of war.
3-4 weeks is enough to almost finish a person mentally, and then it takes probably 1 more week to kill him or her physically. And that's what we saw on Eastern Front. They didn't care about nutrition, didn't care about shelter.
There was just not enough food for people, especially for small children.
Those who die of hunger are one statistic. Those who survive with development compromised by malnutrition or who die from diseases associated with famine are another. Their number is unknown.
The invasion of Sicily. Just part of the biggest invasion armada in history. A heavy night bombardment from the sea preceded the landing.
They would, at night, drop flares on the ships to light it up like you were on a stage. So the dive bombers would come in. They made a screech that would scare you, and they would attack the convoy. But there were a couple of ships that were sunk, some with troops.
The Allies had landed and were winning the battle in Sicily. Even while the troops were coming ashore, a rebellion was catching fire in Rome. Il Duce had had his moment of glory. His goose-stepping, black-shirted legions had held the center of the stage for over 20 years, but their day of reckoning was now at hand.
On July 24th, 25th, the fascist Grand Council had voted for the removal of Mussolini.
They voted 19-7, and such was his level of psychological protection that he didn't quite register what had happened. He went home, went to sleep, and he came back to the office the next morning as though nothing had happened. And waiting there, instead of his car, was an ambulance, with windows covered up to take him into imprisonment.
The first dictator is knocked out, and Italy, even under martial law, cheers Il Duce's fall.
General Jodl told Hitler,
"The whole fascist movement went pop like a soap bubble."
Fascist emblems came down. The people who had suffered 3.5 years of unwanted war made a carnival of their celebration. Soon they would be at peace with the world, or so they thought. Soon Italy would become the sunny, happy place it had been, or so they thought.
Italy signed an armistice on September 3rd. The news was made public on the 8th, the day troops began landing at Salerno.
This captured enemy newsreel film shows the escape of the Duce, the ex-Duce to be more correct, and very ex he looks. German paratroops rescued him from captivity in Italy, and a German plane flew him to Hitler's headquarters.
After meeting Hitler, Il Duce returned to Italy as head of a puppet regime based at the small town of Salo on Lake Garda. Hitler ordered a staged withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, based on a succession of well-prepared defensive positions. The first was the Gustav Line, halfway between Naples and Rome.
The Germans came in force, and we opened fire on them, and the battle started. They quickly assessed that we didn't have very much in the way of weapons to fight them back. And the mortars started coming down. And they were on the higher ground down where we were. They gave us a very, very rough time. At one stage, they were that close to us. A German officer walked through with his map board, and he was shouting about A Company or something, and he passed not very far from me until he was shot. But he didn't know where he was. He thought he was amongst his own people. So that's how close they got.
The Allies launched 5 offensives against the Gustav Line, anchored at Monte Cassino between October 12, 1943 and January 17, 1944, and 4 more from February 2nd to May 17th, against the monastery itself. General Alphonse Juin's Free French, led by Moroccan irregulars skilled in mountain warfare, opened the way for the Polish Second Corps to carry Monte Cassino in a final assault on May 17th.
With my friend, I explored the area at night, and we found German helmets, and with German helmets, we pretended to be Germans. They asked questions, and we would say, jawohl, jawohl. And there were 12 cement bunkers with 1 window each, from which they were shooting. We managed to disable them by throwing grenades into the bunkers. And that's why we managed to destroy them.
American armor and British infantry finally moved forward on May 23rd, the same day that the bottled-up forces broke out of the Anzio beachhead. The Anzio landing, an attempt to outflank the Gustav Line, had gone in on January 22nd.
Operation Shingle on the surface was a really good idea. The idea was to land on the coast and outflank the Gustav Line, which the Germans were holding in the south of Italy.
Major General P. Lucas had a beachhead 24 kilometers wide and 12 deep, with armor ashore by the 24th. By then, the Germans had brought up 6 divisions to oppose him. He was focused on building up his beachhead rather than advancing from it.
He sat on the beach and entrenched, which essentially was the correct thing to do. But of course, it wasn't what was wanted, which was a quick, rapid advance inland.
In late February, General Lucas was replaced. On May 11th, the Allies launched Diadem, a major offensive towards Rome.
I set my machine gun up, and there was a tree in there. It wasn't a big giant tree, but it was a tree. And all of a sudden, a bullet comes through the tree, and when it exit, it was wood, it splatters me all across the face, and it knocked me back. You know, and I'm like, oh, they treated me, wanted to give me, put me in for a Purple Heart, and I said, oh, no, 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 I don't want that. I don't want my people to get no telegram, you know?
On May 15th, Kesselring, commanding German troops, ordered a withdrawal to the next prepared position, now called the Dora Line.
The Germans, of course, under Albert Kesselring, who's one of the greatest German commanders of the war, used the Italian terrain and its climate to brilliant effect.
And all of a sudden, these Germans were flying over us, dropping pamphlets. 10th Mountain Division, welcome. You will be all killed. You will never come back alive to your country. What's scare into you?
Allied troops entered Rome on June 5th. It was not the triumphal progress they had dreamed. Most Romans, for their own reasons, remained indoors, and most newspapers soon turned to events further north. Even before the fall of Rome, Kesselring had decided to withdraw to his next position, the Gothic Line. The Allied assault began in late August and continued until the terrain and weather together brought a halt to the campaign at Christmas. It was renewed in April 1945 when the fighting was to last for less than a month.
Well, like they say, you had to kill or be killed, you know what I mean? I remember this German bunker that must have been hit with an artillery shell, and this German was yelling for help. One of the guys going with a grenade, he pulls a pin and throws it right in there. Boom. And everything was quiet. I tried to stop him, you know, but maybe he was, in a way, he was right.
SS General Karl Wolff, in defiance of Berlin's orders, approached the Allies, and an instrument of surrender was signed on April 29th. The day before Hitler's suicide, and the day after partisans shot Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci. As the war blazed through its last act, in Western Europe, on the Eastern Front, and with the Allies moving closer and closer to Japan's home islands, the price to be paid soared beyond imagination. 6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people for whom for 6 years and 1 day there was hell on earth. The war entered its 5th year. Millions were under arms. Millions were working in factories. The strength, the resources, the reserves of one side of the conflict were so clearly greater than those of the other, and yet there would be no surrender before defeat. The bloodiest months of the war were still ahead. In January 1944, and despite losses of 4.5 million, German armed forces reached their greatest strength, with 9.5 million under arms. The year opened with a Soviet surge, pushing German forces back to within 30 kilometers of the Polish border and liberating 300 towns and villages. Georgy Vinogradov was with the Soviet army.
Germans started to retreat. They left their motorcycle and sidecar. One soldier came to me and said that he would sit in the sidecar and shoot. We shot many Germans.
On January 15th, Soviet forces broke through the ring around Leningrad, linking with units coming from the east at the village of Robska. One Red Army soldier reported,
"We didn't take many prisoners."
By lifting the siege at Leningrad, they showed that the war was over for the Germans. Once the Germans had retreated from Leningrad, they didn't move any further west. They were being pushed slowly back, right back to Berlin.
On the 27th, the Moscow-Leningrad railway line was cleared. The 872-day siege was at an end. The spring offensive, to open at the beginning of March, saw the Soviets outnumber the Germans by 2-1 in infantry and by a slightly greater number in armor. By April 15th, crashed over all three of the river lines, the Bug, the Dniester, and the Prut, on which the Germans might have hoped to make a stand. The most productive land in the USSR was back in Soviet hands, and Stalin was planning the campaign to finally eject the invader from Russian soil. Boris Feofanov was in the front line.
Белорусской операции, да, мы чувствовали, что что-то готовится, поскольку стала поступать артиллерия. Не дали 16 человек, взвод стал 28 человек. Причем пополнение это было из Средней Азии.
Between July 1943 and May 1944, Germany lost 41 divisions in the Soviet Union. 342,000 men between March and May 1944 alone. On May 12th, Marshal Zhukov said,
"It is necessary to prepare an operation that will be like an earthquake."
The Germans have no idea that this avalanche of resources is going to hit them.
Two senior staff officers, Sergei Stemenko and Semyon Timoshenko, considered the pros and cons of offensive action in the northern, central, or southern parts of the line. Their conclusion persuasively argued for concentration of forces in the center. Stalin began his great offensive, Operation Bagration, on June 20th, with partisan attacks that put more than 1,000 transport nodes out of action. The main attacks moved on June 23rd, when 166 divisions, supported by 2,700 tanks, advanced on a 1,300-kilometer front against German Army Group Center, which could deploy only 37 poorly supported divisions to oppose it.
The Germans have 600 aircraft to cover Army Group Center. The Soviets have more than 5,000. And the really telling point of the Soviet strength is artillery. And they have something like 25,000 guns concentrated against 2,500 German guns.
Germany's drive to the east was broken.
By the end of the first day, the Germans had been pushed back 16 kilometers. Within a week, the German line was smashed. The Germans were falling back on Bobruisk, Stolzby, Minsk, and Grodno, with losses of 38,000 killed, 116,000 taken prisoner, 2,000 tanks destroyed, and 10,000 guns lost.
Мы приходили в села, где ни одного человека не было. Немцы убегали, боясь, а их пугала пропаганда немецкая, что Красная Армия придет и будет мстить за те злодеяния, которые они совершали на территории Советского Союза. Вот в этом городе мы остановились со штабом вместе с 4-м корпусом. И часть его в земле. И вдруг мы слышим детский плач. Ну, скорее открыли крышку, и что мы видим? Мать задушила одну свою девочку, а другую пыталась задушить, но мы, конечно, их освободили, не дали. Всех оставшихся в живых, еще 2 девочки и эту мать, завели в свой штаб, дали успокоиться, накормили. И потом эта женщина горько сожалела.
The first great city to fall in 1941, Minsk, was back in Soviet hands on July 3rd, trapping the German Fourth Army between the city and the river. By the end of July, Bagration was less than 100 kilometers from Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze at Ratzenberg. Before July 1944, Germany had suffered 2.8 million war dead. In the next 9.5 months, until Berlin fell, a further 4.8 million would die. In the operations in the Ukraine, fought concurrently with Bagration, Kelm and Lublin fell. West of Lublin, the Red Army came upon the first of the death camps, Majdanek. Azoris Artemov.
When we were moving from Vistula, we saw those who were released. Those people who were walking toward us. They used to be kept in concentration camp. It was in Majdanek. We saw rooms of cloth, glasses, samples of human skin. Gas stoves where bodies were burnt.
On July 25th, with the Soviet troops west of the Bug, Lieutenant General Tadeusz Bohr-Komanowski, commanding the Polish Home Army, telegraphed London.
We are ready to fight for the liberation of Warsaw at any moment.
About 2/3 of the city on the west bank of the Vistula was in Polish hands on the second day, August 2nd, 1944, and Polish flags were flying from the top of many buildings. German reinforcements arrived. Soviet troops did not.
They did not assume, as well as Germans did not, that Soviets would stop their offensive for more than 5 months. The decision to stop the offensive for 5 months must have been taken by Stalin himself.
The Warsaw insurgents telegraphed,
We are without any material or moral support. The soldiers and population of the capital look hopelessly at the skies.
Following the failure of the uprising, demolition squads were guided by German experts to Warsaw's most significant cultural and historical sites and destroyed them. In one of his last speeches to the Reichstag, Hitler boasted of this pointlessly vindictive act.
Warsaw is now no more than a geographical term on the map of Europe.
On October 16th, Soviet troops broke into East Prussia, within 80 kilometers of Rastenburg. Boris Feofanov.
Year of 1944 was distinctive in defeating the Germans. Little by little, it started to become obvious that they were no longer interested in war. They started to retreat.
By the end of 1944, the only members of the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht left on Soviet soil were prisoners of war, and Soviet forces were fighting west towards Berlin.
Beaten Nazis, and Moscow likes the demonstration.
Anglo-American forces were moving towards them, having landed 17 days before Bagration on the beaches of Normandy.
Although all logic said that the Allies, with an overwhelming superiority of armor, ships, aircraft, were overwhelmingly likely to get ashore and be able to stay there. If they failed, the consequences would be disastrous, and every man involved with planning and preparing that invasion knew just how high the stakes were.
General Alan Brooke wrote on June 5th that Overlord
may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war.
On June 5th, General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, prepared a statement. It said,
Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone.
His statement was not required. On June 5th, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead and said,
I hope to God I know what I'm doing.
Operation Overlord planned to combine the efforts of thousands of aircraft and ships and nearly 3 million men in landing 133,000 soldiers, their tanks and vehicles on an 80-kilometer stretch of beach in a single day, D-Day. 12,000 British and American aircraft were to support the landing. Opposing them, the Luftwaffe's 3rd Air Fleet boasted 169 serviceable aircraft. Operation Neptune, the naval part of Overlord, provided for the disposition of 6,843 vessels. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay's task was to gather them at assembly points from around the British coastline, shepherd them through narrow lanes cleared of mines, and bring them through unpredictable seas to a fortified enemy coastline.
As we got out to sea, there were 5,000 ships to make the invasion into Normandy, and it was a sight to see.
It was rough. The sea was rough. And men were sick, mostly because they were hungry. We were briefed on board the ship as well. And that was our objective. Everybody meet there. Get off the beach as fast as you can. And eventually you'll see the church and make your own way there through the streets.
Troops came ashore between 6 and 7:30 a.m. on a 96-kilometer front. More than 156,000 came ashore on the first day. Leon Gautier was with the Free French.
We land on the 6th at 7:23 in the morning. The first job was to take the blockhouse opposite the beach. We had orders to run very quickly toward the blockhouse. There was no stopping on the way because in a battle, you must be a moving target all the time. So run to the blockhouse, take the blockhouse.
Rommel had 34 divisions facing the invasion, but many were facing the wrong way. Most were under strength, and some were feeble units comprised exclusively of men with stomach complaints. And by D-Day, 1/6 of the German 7th Army used troops recruited during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The US 1st Division on Omaha faced the best of the German formations, the 352nd Division.
All the troops were disembarked and went ashore, and we just stood by to handle casualties.
Allied casualties on Utah Beach were the lowest of the day. 197 out of 23,000 men landed.
And there was flashes and that all over the place. And I saw somebody shout from the landing craft, "Get off the beach, get off the beach." She didn't have to tell me to do that. I was on my way anyway. There was one of them, and he's looking at his shoulder in a stupid sort of way, you know. There was bits of his arm flying off. He was taking a full burst in his shoulder, and he was just looking at it.
As night fell on June 6th, 83,115 British and 73,000 American troops were ashore. By the 9th, the first Allied airfields were open for business. By the 10th, the British were joined to Omaha. Omaha Beach was joined to Utah by the 13th. Within 4 weeks, the initial 133,000 had swollen to a force of 850,000 men, 150,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies. Stalin telegraphed Churchill,
"Overlord is a source of joy to us all."
By July 25th, the Allies had landed 1,450,000 men and more than 4,000 tanks.
D-Day meant that the Allies in the West were now on the mainland of Europe in sufficient numbers that the German war machine could not possibly cope with what was happening.
At the end of July, von Kluge, commanding the German army in the West, told Hitler,
"The moment has drawn near when this front will break."
Since D-Day, German forces had lost 2,117 tanks and 113,000 men. They had received as replacement 10,078 men and 17 tanks.
Le 18 juillet, nous sommes reculés et nous sommes rentrés dans, ça s'appelle la poche de falaise.
300,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket. Their armor was decimated. The 116th Division, for example, was reduced from more than 100 to just a dozen tanks.
Et puis, dans la poche de falaise, il y avait quand même 10 000 morts. Quelquefois, c'est vrai, on a marché sur des cadavres. Hein. Et puis, on essayait aussi, dans des cadavres, de trouver soit des cigarettes ou quelque chose pour amorcer. Hein. Parce que déjà des semaines avant. Hein.
The resolute defense of the 12th SS Panzer Hitler Youth Division in holding open the neck of the pocket until August 21st permitted the escape of substantial forces, but left behind 50,000 dead. On August 19th, British and American armies linked up. And on August 25th, Group Charles de Gaulle walked triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. Flags flew, everybody cheered.
Paris hails the liberating Allies, stars and stripes, and the flag of Canada. And everywhere is seen Mademoiselle of Gay Paris.
Some unfortunate women accused of collaborating had their heads shaved. But everyone else felt liberated.
It gives them the image of the people who liberated France. Everybody knows Paris has not been liberated by herself. Everybody knows that it's been liberated because there are huge American forces just outside Paris.
Liberation. De Gaulle, symbol of free France. And resurgent Paris cheers to the strains of the Marseillaise.
On September 11th, US patrols crossed the German border near Aachen. 5 days later, Hitler announced,
"I have made a momentous decision. I shall go over to the offensive."
Adolf Hitler himself had this, what I would say, delusional idea that he could send 200,000 German soldiers through this 70-mile front, steamroll an entire million-man American army.
The ill-fated Operation Market Garden commenced the day after Hitler's pronouncement.
Market Garden's basically two operations. Market is the airborne operation where they drop airborne troops beyond the bridges. Garden is the land advance to join up with those airborne forces. And it sounds like a sensible idea.
The seizure by American airborne divisions of bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen was a great success.
Except they literally dropped the 1st Allied Airborne Army onto the top of a German SS Panzer Division.
John Humphreys was part of the attack on Arnhem.
20 parachutists, 10 each side. And I'm reading Reader's Digest and wondering what's going to happen when we get to the other end. Red on, stand up, hook up, green on, go, and out we went. The two SS Panzer divisions were laid up some miles outside of Arnhem, and of course, really, we'd taken them by surprise, but they were quick to react.
The assault on the bridge at Arnhem by the British 1st Airborne Division was the bridge too far.
It was attack after attack after attack. Brengan was killed by my side, and when he died, he spilled his blood all over me so hard. And then German officer in cultured English said, if you don't come out, I'll blow you out. So I came out.
The Normandy beaches finally closed down on November 16th. On the morning of December 16th, a 145-kilometer front was held by 4 American divisions. 2 had been sent to the quiet Ardennes to recuperate, and 1 was yet to see action. 1 inexperienced armored division was in support. It was onto this force that 2 panzer armies fell, initiating Operation Herbstnebel, Autumn Mist, the Battle of the Bulge.
We're around Bastogne. We're in a farmhouse. And I was laying next to a buddy of mine, and all of a sudden we hear this thud. And it went right between us. We both went like that. It was an 88, but it didn't go off. So I looked over at him and I said, holy snow. He said, I just did.
Eisenhower reacted swiftly, drawing armored formations to the flank of the attack, where they blocked and frustrated the German advance.
Patton, of course, famously pivots Third Army. While there's a lot of legend around that, the broad proposition was that all around the Bulge, the Germans were under significant pressure.
We were one of the divisions Patton promised to send up. Here we're thinking when they drop us off, we're going to get dropped off at a house, get warmed up and everything. They took us into the middle of the woods and built and dumped us on the ground. And it was cold. I never saw grown men cry from the cold.
Perhaps no general other than Patton, in the western side anyway, could have been quite as successful at turning his army 90 degrees to come to the rescue of those at Bastogne. He drove his forces hard, they got there quickly, and it was a very impressive example of the skill of generalship.
And then around Christmas Eve, the weather clears. And once, of course, that happens, you've got a vast asset in the Allied air forces.
The attack was blunted, the spearhead stopped. The Nazi columns contained and thrown back by men who had flung themselves into the breach.
On January 13th, the American 82nd and British 1st Airborne Divisions made contact in the center of what had been the salient, the Bulge. By the 16th, the front had been fully restored.
It was the Battle of the Ardennes which actually finally broke the back of the panzer arm of the Wehrmacht and allowed the Soviet Union their incredible advance just short of Berlin in 2 weeks.
The offensive cost the US 5th Army Group 19,000 dead and 15,000 prisoners. But in the first 2 months of 1945, the United States made good its losses by landing 7 fully equipped, full-strength divisions in Europe, 3 of them armored. Germany, which had lost 100,000 men killed, wounded or captured in the Ardennes, and 800 tanks and 1,000 aircraft, simply could not make good its losses.
And then we were moved up to the Rhine, and we didn't know why, of course, but the idea, well, the basic idea is we were going to be the thrust into mainland Germany. And all we knew was Germany was across the river, and we all piddled in the river for good luck.
In the month of January, Wehrmacht's losses totaled 451,742 killed, roughly the equivalent of American losses for the entire war. On January 31st, the first Belarusian front crossed the Oder. Soviet troops opened the year with an attack across the Vistula. Warsaw fell on January 17th, Krakow on the 18th, the same day as Budapest. After 2 weeks, the Soviet army advanced 400 kilometers and stood 80 kilometers from Berlin. There, it paused. Stalin diverted troops, adding Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany, with Yugoslavia and Finland as client states, to the USSR's pre-war territory before naming April 16th as the day for the assault on Berlin. On April 1st, Hitler moved to the bunker system behind and below the Chancellery. In the streets of Berlin, 10,000 Germans were hanged by their own for defeatism and cowardice, mostly from street lamps.
Right up into the last days of the war, Germans were told they would be shot if they put up a white flag.
The Soviet attack opened with 8,983 guns, firing 1,236,000 rounds on the first day. When Zhukov's and Konev's forces joined hands west of Potsdam on April 25th, they had encircled Berlin.
The Soviets had more than 2.2 million men and more than 6,000 tanks. The Germans could only muster 850,000 men and 1,500 tanks.
By April 27th, the area of Berlin, still in German hands, was 16 kilometers long and less than 5 kilometers wide.
Дальше картинка сразу. Берлин преобразился. Покрылся белым цветом. Из окон, балконов, где только можно, белые полотнища. Простыни, наволочки, что угодно белое было, вывешивали. Берлинское население, не подтверждало, а само капитулировало, сообщало о своей безоговорочной капитуляции.
Adolf Hitler dictated his final testament. Then, on April 30th, had lunch, poisoned his dog, and killed himself. An hour earlier, soldiers of Zhukov's Third Army had planted a red banner atop the Reichstag.
Там Берлина, нас повернули строго на юг, на Рейхстаг, поэтому волей-неволей я принял участие.
The point was to get to the roof and put the red banner of victory on the roof.
Berlin was the great prize. There's something deeply psychological in the idea of occupying the enemy's capital.
Царица полей. И вот однажды выходи строиться. Все ясно. А тут подъем, никакой тревоги, никакого в ружье, ничего нет. Все, что ж делать? Зачем подняли-то? Неясно. Потом посмотрели на улицу, в городке в таком жили, а там уже солдат до полна.
But it was not over. Hundreds of thousands were yet to die. On June 15th, 1944, with Allied forces fighting inland from the Normandy beaches, 2 American divisions landed at Saipan in the Marianas. The death toll in the battle for an island of 119 square kilometers was 3,426 American and 24,000 Japanese dead, many of them civilians.
We were off Saipan. We saw civilians diving off the cliffs, committing suicide with their children.
Between June 19th and 21st, the largest carrier battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was contested as a preliminary to the liberation of the Philippines. Japan lost 3 carriers. The United States lost no ships and landed 100,000 tons of supplies. MacArthur had returned. Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations, met with Admirals Nimitz and Spruance in San Francisco. They agreed to make Okinawa the principal target, but in order to establish air superiority, agreed that a nearby island should also be taken. This was Iwo Jima.
Then D-Day itself brought 800 ships and thousands of small landing craft to the shores of the island, which was defended by thousands of Japs, every one of whom was prepared to die for his emperor.
We took the troops to Iwo Jima on a D-Day with all the thousands of ships, Australian, English, and American, and we were anchored right off Mount Surabaki.
In early 1944, Major General Tadamichi Kurabayashi and the 21,000 men of the 109th Division had been sent to turn Iwo Jima into an impregnable fortress.
They were dug into more than 20 miles of interconnecting tunnels and gun emplacements. Iwo Jima was the first island, the first battle in which the Japanese inflicted more casualties on the Americans than they suffered themselves.
The invasion fleet approached Iwo Jima on February 19th. A third of those who landed were either wounded or killed. More than a third of the Marine Corps fatalities for the whole war for possession of an island of about 30 square kilometers.
Why on earth, when everybody knew that the war was approaching its end, why they didn't just shut them up in that corner of the island and leave them to sweat, leave them to rot on that island? I guess mainly for the sake of saying we won.
At the end of the battle, all that remained of the Japanese garrison of 21,000 was 54 prisoners, 2 of whom committed suicide. For the assault on Okinawa, 430 assault transports were loaded at 11 ports, from Seattle to Leyte. On April 1st, 1,300 ships were massed offshore. By nightfall, more than 60,000 Americans were ashore.
The Japanese moved inland and dug into caves. Then the Americans, whether they're soldiers or Marines, needed to adapt, make their landing, and then move inland and turn it from an amphibious assault into essentially an inland operation, a ground operation against entrenched enemy forces.
Okinawa was defended by the 100,000-strong 32nd Army of General Ushijima Mitsuru, who committed suicide at the conclusion of the battle. Virtually his entire command and tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, many by suicide, died. On July 2nd, the Okinawa campaign was declared over. The Japanese lost 110,000 troops, including 1,465 kamikaze pilots, who accounted for 29 ships sunk, 120 damaged, and 3,048 sailors killed.
We got it just minutes after 4 o'clock, and it's all hell to pay. It hit the superstructure. You call it chimney, the stack where we were, and everything went blank. It wasn't a pretty scenery, you know. It was a kamikaze, he took us out. We found his body just part with a parachute. You know, we were young, couldn't understand why he had a parachute on. I would tell you this, and this is hard for me to tell you. He did his job and he did it well.
On the 16th of July, the first atomic bomb was tested at Alamogordo.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died on April 12th.
One of the greatest men in American history is laid to rest.
Churchill had been soundly defeated at a general election on July 5th.
Labour landslide.
New leaders faced Stalin across the conference table in Potsdam.
Would bear the fruit of friendly and lasting agreement amid the sharp thorns of Europe's post-war problems.
And a new president, Harry S. Truman, faced a profound decision.
The Japanese in the tiny council at the top were not still, despite the fact that people were starving to death, and kept on saying, no, we should equip schoolboys with pikes, we should defend at all costs, we will never surrender.
A B-29 bomber took off at 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945. Little Boy was dropped at 31,600 feet and detonated at 1,885 feet, generating a blast of 300,000 degrees Celsius for 1/10,000th of a second.
It allowed the peace party to argue to their own people. They were not defeated by these white guys, these soldiers, or the Air Force anywhere in the world. They were defeated by modern science. So modern science allowed the Japanese a face-saving gesture to get out of the war. In the end, they were defeated by technology.
The bomb was designed to knock a city down, rather than blow it up. 63% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed. About 140,000 people were killed. Ultimately, the death toll would reach an estimated 200,000. Kenji Kitagawa was in school, 11 years old.
ここはね、パーッと青白くね、真っ白に光ったんですよ。ピカーッとね。からね、ドーンという大音響がして爆風が来てガラガラガラガラガラと紅茶がめちゃめちゃに壊れたの。これでその下敷きになったんですよ、だから。
そしたらまだね生き残った友達がいたと見えてね、瓦礫の中でね、お父さんお母さん痛いよ助けてって叫び声や泣き声が聞こえてくるね。そしたらね、いっぱい人が流れてきだしたん、上流からみんな川へ飛び込んだりするから暑いしね、やけどしてるし。川がね、みんな阿鼻叫喚の地獄の川になったんですよ、いっぱいいっぱい。そこらの川もみんなそうなったんですよ、いっぱいいっぱい人がみんな飛び込んでひどいやけどしたりしてね、飛び込んでるから。助けてくれって言ったってどうしようもないわね。
3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On the same day, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria.
When the Red Army attacked Manchuria, that was the end of that. Now, in 1 week, and that's the week that the Red Army moved against the Japanese, they killed 82,000 Japanese soldiers, probably wounded 200,000.
Hideki Kuribayashi was with the Japanese army in Manchuria.
8月9日の朝ですよ。地平線のこの果てからね、むぐむぐとしたようなのが上がってきてさ、ぐーっと。そしてパッと火を吹くとね、こっちのうちは吹っ飛んじゃうんだ。砲撃されるの、戦車に。戦車がぎゅーっと上がって大砲がパッとこのぐらい上がるとね、パッと火を吹くんですよ。だからその日の朝は8月9日の朝は190人でうちはいたんですよ、仲間が。それがお昼には50名近くなっちゃったの、みんな戦死しちゃって。
A week after the Soviet troops attacked, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time in a radio broadcast.
We have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
On September 2nd, General Wainwright, who had surrendered his command in the Philippines, and General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore, gaunt figures released from Japanese captivity, stood behind General MacArthur as he accepted the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. Around the world, the dying continued, the fighting continued, but that war, at least, was done with.
Entire populations had been wiped out. Communities had been destroyed, their cultural identities and memories had been wiped out, and still to this day, many of these communities have never recovered or never will be able to recover.
Millions died. Many more millions survived, fought or suffered, or just got by, and then stepped away from history and got on with living ordinary lives. They never forgot the war, but they had families and friends and better things to think about. By our own agency, we made hell on earth. But earth is not hell.